Thank you for bearing with us, and I hope everybody had a quick break. And I know there's a lot happening. There's Stammtisch, there's Trafo, the weather's nice outside. But we have one exciting kind of conclusion to the symposium part of the program, which we're really excited about, which is a keynote by Vanessa Andreotti, who is joining us live from British Columbia and will be visible behind me on screen. Hi, Vanessa. So how this is going to work is I'm going to just quickly introduce, my name is Alison, by the way, I work here at E-WERK. Sorry, that could have mentioned that. And I'm just going to quickly introduce Vanessa and Lucia, who will later, after Vanessa gives the presentation, be in conversation with Vanessa. So Vanessa behind me on the screen, Vanessa Andreotti is a Latinx professor and new dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria. She works across sectors in international and comparative education, particularly focusing on global justice and citizenship, Indigenous and community engagement, global change, and social and ecological responsibility. Her research examines relationships between historical, systemic, and ongoing forms of violence and the inherent unsustainability of modernity. Andreotti is the author of Hospicing Modernity, Facing Humanity's Wrongs and the Implications for Social Activism, which is an incredible read that we highly recommend everybody grab from your local bookstore. And Vanessa presents, she'll be in conversation with Lucia Pietroiusti, who is the head of ecologies at Serpentine in London. She is a curator working at the intersection of art, ecology, and systems, usually outside of the gallery space. And she was the founder of the General Ecology project at the Serpentine. So, just to quickly say about this talk, this will be a conversation after Vanessa presents about the stories we tell about ourselves, what we want them to do, what they show, what they hide, where they come from, where they lead us to, and how they enable us and or constrain possibilities for different worlds and forms of coexistence. We'll focus on the story of modernity, which is a particular story of progress, development, and civilization, and the hold this story has on our imagination and our internal and collective neurobiological infrastructures, our intellectual, emotional, and relational conscious and unconscious landscapes. And without further ado, I will pass over to Vanessa directly, who will speak further. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to have been invited to this gathering. I would like to start by saying that I am on the unceded lands of the Luckenwalde Indigenous peoples. And since I'm also of mixed heritage, my dad is of German heritage and my mom is of Indigenous ancestry. I would also like to start with a Guarani land acknowledgement, which is a bit different from the land acknowledgements we do here in Canada. So in this land acknowledgement, we greet the land as a living entity, not as a property or a resource. We also acknowledge our ancestors, and the ancestors are not only those who have come before, they are also those who have yet to come, and that call us to our responsibility for sustaining life on this planet. Then we also acknowledge those at whose expense we have been gathering here today. So if I'm doing it online, I need to acknowledge the mining of the minerals that make it possible for us to be on screens and for the internet networks to work, and acknowledge the violence, the systemic historical violence that happens so that we can be here today. And the fact that if we live in the global north, in the majority world, we are buffered, the minority world, we are buffered from the violence inflicted on the majority world for us to be here. And the last acknowledgement is the acknowledgement that we are all relations, not only us as humans, but also non-humans. non-human beings as part of a wider metabolism that is the earth, that is currently in disease out of human-induced diseases, basically. So these acknowledgements call for our responsibility to be talking about these things today, to try to bring this web of relations into some kind of into a better, more generative way of moving together. So that's I think my invitation for this talk is for us to have the conversation, having that responsibility and accountability both to the ancestors past and to come, and to the violence that enables us to be here today, present with us. But I think the idea was to have a conversation with Julie, and I'm going to be waiting for the questions. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, Vanessa. I think you can see me at a distance. Oh, this one? Okay.
Yep.
Well, I'm going to take this opportunity to thank the team at E-WERK and Moritz, who's directing from behind the camera. Vanessa, we've just met. So first of all, how are you this morning?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. We're sort of edging into afternoon sunshine, and I think that's sort of manifesting in the mood in the room. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, and acknowledge your generosity in accepting to be in this conversation with us today. Perhaps I could start with this very, very, very brief declaration of love for hospicing modernity, which is this book. Everyone. If I'm sort of half quoting, half paraphrasing, but you talk about hospicing modernity, about a book of, I suppose, medicines and tools for facing the death of modernity around us and within us with humility and grace. And what I would sort of say to that is that whilst reading it, and really it was like taking one big breath in and then getting to the end of the book, and getting really angry with it and getting really sad by it, and just really sort of working through what the book does as medicine. I would just describe it as a book of our time, that it sort of really speaks to that sense that something is ending or something is collapsing, as nested and interdependent collapses at psychic, maybe organizational, maybe community and societal, maybe planetary level. And how to live through that collapse without violence, without inflicting violence. And so it's a book also about healing through facing. It's also a book of stories and how they are alive and how they change within us and through us. And it's a book of teachings. And I'm just going to tell you this little story, which is that I got to the end of it, having felt all these feelings. And then there's a section that is called the pitfalls of... the pitfalls to avoid, when thinking about decolonial work and decolonial thought. And one of them was, don't confuse self-actualization with decolonization. And I had that moment of like, oh, I've just had a really profound singular experience of myself. And I thought that was the work done, but it's just not. So that's a very long-winded way of saying thank you for the book. And perhaps there are words with which you would describe it, which might be a very sort of good place for us to start, is to ask you to describe sort of what prompted you to write it, and how, if you're speaking to the people in this room, some of whom may not have read it yet, how would you describe it?
Thank you, Julie, for the question. I think I would describe the book in one sentence, probably as a book that looks at the symptoms of how modernity, the story of modernity, has cast a spell, or maybe a book that looks at the spell of modernity, and that sees the crisis, the root of the crisis that we're living as the impairment. It's a relational impairment that is imposed by the sense of separability between us and the rest of nature. So the idea of human beings being separate from nature is the root that creates many different problems, but creates hierarchies between us and the other species, gets us not to think about the consequences of what we do on the planet, and takes us to a space of immaturity and irresponsibility where we refuse to grow up, because growing up is painful, and there's this relationship with pain within modernity, within the story of modernity, which is a single story of progress, development, and civilization that really has created a lot of harm and also brought some gifts. I think in the book too, the idea is not to have a dialectical approach to this is wrong, this is bad, and this is good. It's all part of us. We are complicit. We are part of modernity. We are neurologically impaired by what modernity does to us. We're conditioned by it. We're not determined by it, though. There are possibilities of finding other ways to rewire ourselves, but it's also a collective process. There's no way one individual can do it alone. So figuring out a way to approach this collectively through education is also problematic, because when we think about education, we often think about impairing information, like transferring information. And this is not a problem of information. This is a problem of relationality that is also grounded on defense mechanisms. So we generally frame, in the book, we frame the problem through my research collective as a problem of denials, not a problem of ignorance. And education that addresses denial is very different from education that addresses ignorance, because when we address denial with the information, so people are trying to deny something and you present this information to them, for example, that we are complicit in historical and systemic harm, they shoot the messenger. So because the ego has a lot of defensiveness against these things, against feeling the pain or the responsibility or blame or shame, what the education then needs to do is bypass the defenses of the ego. And that is art. That is a very different process, a very different invitation. It cannot be coercive. So part of the book, the first part of the book, actually, there's a very long chapter trying to convince people not to read the book. Because if they read the book from that defensive response or reaction without understanding this defensive reaction as a defensive reaction, and without taking that as a teacher, they will transfer all the anger and the frustration onto the book or onto me in a way that also is not good for themselves. So it's unhealthy. So part of the book, the first part of the book, tries to teach people how to read the book, basically in a psychoanalytic way. But I'm drawing on a form of psychoanalysis that is not the Western one. And psychoanalysis is probably not the best way to describe it, but it's the way that is closest to the language that we have in Western academic spaces, in Western pedagogical context. But what inspired the book was the work, a network of Indigenous communities in the Global South and also some here in the Global North that start from the problem of the colonization of our unconscious. So what they say is that if our unconscious has been colonized, our imagination is also colonized. And we don't even know about the boundaries that are placed on our imagination. And I think that's why, like, when we think about hope, for example, like, we generally think about hope in the continuity of something rather than placing hope in the present and in the the repairing and weaving of relationships, which is the stuff that actually makes the future. We start to think about this image. But anyway, I said I was going to describe the book in one sentence, and I went on and on. I'm sorry about that.
No, please don't. I wish we could give the experience of what it's like to read it right now, but we can only make a promise. So maybe we just start from, I was thinking of starting actually from the front cover and then the back cover and then go inside. But just the term hospicing. You use this term hospicing and you describe the reasons why. And I was wondering if you could just speak about what you mean by hospicing and how that, like that, maybe it has like slight differences from other forms of care as well, care work.
Mm-hmm. So the way that hospicing is described in the book is about offering palliative care to something that is dying, which means that you're not investing in its futurity. So you're offering care that allows something to die with dignity and integrity and compassion. So you're not trying to kill modernity, but you're not trying to keep it alive either. You're approaching death in a very different way. At the same time that you are offering prenatal care to something that is being born out of this death, that is potentially, but not necessarily wiser. So you're paying attention to these things, and you're trying not to suffocate what is being born with your own projections and idealizations. So you're not suffocating this baby, and you are not assuming that this baby is coming through you either. So the book has a very critical stance against like the feel-good or the self-congratulatory, self-celebratory approach that we generally see in activism, and like it's a compassionate approach too. We understand that it's difficult work, but there is this exceptionalism and exaltedness that is also part of the colonial project. So we're trying to invite people to do this with humility so that they can also see their failures in the process as enormous opportunities for learning and the need for making that learning public. Because the seeds, as people try to disinvest from modernity, there's also a lot of people trying to divest from it. So there's a difference between disinvestment and divestment. In divestment, you try to just break away from and just turn your back and go. Disinvestment, you stay. And you stay through the complexities, the paradoxes, the contradictions. And you give it your best shot to learn from what is dying, to be taught by what's dying, actually. And the divestment approach that many activists, many people, it's impulse, right? This is, I want to break away and I want to be good. I want to affirm my innocence and my benevolence, and which are complex, but that is also a colonial move. And in order for us to be able to do that in a different way, we need to recognize it as such, and figure out how we stay, as Donna Haraway says, how we stay with the trouble, and how we in the project, in the research collective and in the book, we talk about how to compost our shit, literally and metaphorically, how to stay with what's difficult and painful without relationships falling apart, without us feeling overwhelmed and immobilized, and without us demanding a quick fix or to be rescued from the discomfort. So if I go back to the question about hospicing is about developing our capacity to stomach what's difficult and what's nauseating without throwing up, without throwing a tantrum, and without throwing in the towel, and staying with this death, approaching death relating to death very differently, both the death of the system and our own death, in order to be able to actually live well. So what we learned from the indigenous communities in the South is that living well, and I'm not talking here about the good life. This is buen vivir. It's a paradigm, a philosophy that challenges the Western philosophy of a good life. Living well is very different from pursuing a good life. So living well is inseparable from dying well. And if we don't know how to die well, that's where we take up arms to defend the wealth we have accumulated, even though this wealth is not giving us anything, and not even the security that we thought it was going to give us at the end of this period of modernity. So hospicing would be about generatively approaching an end or ends with much more maturity and wisdom. And listening to the stories now of failure and of success that will help us support that which the earth is birthing, which is the new system, whatever it is that it may be.
Thank you so much. Maybe we can stay a little bit on the question of accompanying through death and accompanying through birth, and the point at which these two things meet. I wanted to actually ask you, so that one of the, I mean, in my opinion of reading it, but one of the very strong emotional cores of the book is a story that was transmitted to you by a Cree elder about the four mountains, and those four mountains having an uphill and a downhill element to them, and corresponding to different phases of life in which we learn, we struggle, and we teach, sort of younger generations ongoing. You make the point very strongly that writing down the story is not doing justice to the fact that the story is alive, but nevertheless, reading through that story at home, in sort of my grandparents' place, made it very, very clear how much what Elizabeth Pavinelli calls the ancestral present, how much the people that are no longer there are still holding the words that came are still holding your world in place. And these are not words from your book. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about this birth, sort of accompanying through death as a way of also learning to birth give, and perhaps also particularly what role sort of parenting, and also you yourself as a parent human being, sort of, what you may have learned from that experience for this book.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I think I'll start with a critique also that is common amongst this network of indigenous communities in Brazil, that says that of all beings, or of all other animals in the planet, human beings are the youngest. And here I'm not sure, like it's take it as a symbolic youngest, right, rather than an evolutionary youngest. So human beings are the youngest, and of all cultures, the Western culture is also the youngest. And in terms of its life cycle, it's in its teenage years, and it's like it's a teenager with a machine gun in its hands. So the other cultures, this story goes, they cannot grow up for the Western culture. The Western culture needs to grow up for itself, but they need to support the process of growing up. And you do need your uncles, aunties, and all your grandparents to be able for this, to enable this culture to find its pathway to wanting maturity, to wanting to age well and die well. So instead of, we generally use the story to say there's no point as going into the indigenous communities and asking for detailed instructions. They can't give you that. What they can give you is direction. And direction is always towards realizing that we're part of a much larger continuum than the individual self. And also that the main point of it all is responsibility. So, and as you age, you embrace more of this responsibility, and it's a kind of a visceral responsibility. It's not an intellectual choice or a matter of convenience, right? And it can go against your self-interest sometimes, and still you would do the right thing, even if it goes against that. So developing this deeper level of responsibility is the responsibility of a culture that can produce grown-ups. And our Western culture, through its hyper-individualization and also its hyper-consumerism, and now with its narcissistic tendencies, has really turned its back to that and created a bubble, a delusional bubble that it is separate from its surroundings, right? Its metabolic surroundings. And in saying this, I'm seeing ourselves as cells in a wider metabolism that is the planet or the cosmos. So in saying that, it's almost like it takes a village. It takes a village to raise a child. It takes a whole culture to shift people towards the desire to become good elders and good ancestors for all relations. And that's in this point of responsibility to become good elders and ancestors is what sustains life. And if we don't have that commitment, that if we don't recognize or accept that responsibility, the whole system becomes unbalanced, and that's where we have the dis-ease. So part of the problem is that the only pathway to aging that we have in the Western culture is one where you accumulate wealth, you look after your family in terms of wealth transmission, and then you retire and you can enjoy the last years of your life from the wealth you have accumulated and the success you have had, but success defined as achievement of some form of social mobility in the systems of status that are already pre-established, right? That is a diseased pathway of aging. We would need a different one. And I think the 4 stories that you mentioned that is in the book, it's Cree story told by John Cryer, who's a Cree elder. It really gives you the sense that there are other pathways to aging. There are other stories we can tell that really support us to grow up. And the lack of these stories in our in institutions, in modern and Western institutions, is what is creating part of the problem. So I'm starting in relation to my own children. So I have 4, and 2 of them are adults already. One of them is extremely interested in talking about this, actually, as somebody who calls herself identifies with Gen Z, Generation Z. She's 23, and really thinking through the generational gaps that we find right now, of a generation that sees its future stolen from them by the generations that came before them, and also sees the already other incoming generations challenging them to do better and to figure out what to do in the context of social and ecological collapse. And I'm not saying future collapse. I'm talking about the collapses that are happening right now, so that we can be here today, and that have happened in the past, so that we could think of ourselves as deserving of all the comforts that we have today. So I think parenting is one of the most important and difficult jobs that we have, especially in times of impending and ongoing collapse, and that we do need to figure out a different way of doing it, especially as we are challenged by the kids and the young people themselves to do that and to do better, and where we're being blamed for stealing their future. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's an ongoing inquiry and conversation.
It does so much more than answer the question. Thank you. Maybe we can start. You mentioned this sort of term psychoanalysis as a kind of placeholder for the kind of work that this book is encouraging people to at least want to do or like want to face. I thought maybe I could ask you if you wanted to speak a little bit more about this. You speak about sort of people needing to sort of collectively, I suppose, but also psychically and individually face our shadows. And it's sort of, and also, well, I have two questions that come from that. One of them has to do with perhaps the notion, the feeling that I got from that is the notion that perhaps like well-being is a set of like nested relationships, like the psychic well-being of an individual is nested within the well-being of a perhaps family community or sort of local environment, nested within something else, and then the planet, and then the cosmos. And so I was wondering whether you could speak to this set of relationships that are all kind of at different scales, but somehow like retain this entanglement or this connection.
Thank you. Also a super important question. So I'll try. We have recently developed some graphics to talk about exactly what you're talking about, but I don't have them at hand here. I'll try to describe it. So when we talk about relationships within modernity and in Western cultures, we have a very limited way of thinking about them, because it's generally we're thinking about relationships between people or the land even, but there's another way of thinking about this, which is not based on worded language, right? So mainly within modernity, we relate through human constructs of relationships rather than the materiality and the organicity of relations. So, for example, in international relations, the discipline, we would have, okay, there's the individual, there's the family, there's the community, then there's the nation, then there's the international sphere, and that's it. Now, these are nested systems, but these are all human constructs. Like even the construct of the individual, the construct of the family, the construct of the community, these are all human constructs, and they're all anthropocentric. So what would it look like if we try to have a glimpse of what lies beyond that? And for that, I will bring the words of Chief Ninawahunikui from the Amazon, who talks about colonialism as creating this neurobiological impairment. For us to think beyond what we can document, even in language. That separation is also a separation that is related to our relationship with language, our relationship with reality, our relationship with self, our relationship with knowledge and with critique. So he talks about the fact that like climate change, climate destabilization, and biodiversity collapse are not, if we're all entangled, these are not things that are happening outside of us. So the famines, the fires, the floods that are happening in our environment are also happening in the internal landscapes. And our education, our formal modern education, is extremely effective in numbing us to the expression of these effects. And so we believe we are individual capsules navigating this thing with a lot of autonomy, a lot of unaccountable autonomy. But what's happening in our unconscious is that all these fires, famines, and floods are already happening. So Chief Ninawa talks about, when he talks about collapse, social and ecological collapse, he says most people think that it's like lack of access to water or to food or to housing or to shelter or something. But he actually is much more concerned about the internal collapse of the infrastructures of modernity that are happening in Western societies, creating a global mental health crisis that is extremely dangerous to ourselves as humanity. It's putting ourselves on a path of premature extinction. He talks about mass extinction in slow motion, and also to the planet at large. So people are going to destroy it faster. Not destroy the planet. The planet is going to be fine without us. Other beings are gonna come in and from the ruins of all of it, of all we created. But so we cannot destroy the planet, but we can destroy the possibility of the continuity of human life and of other species in the planet. This for sure, we have already, the other species we have already done, our own, we are at risk already of creating this premature extinction, right? So back to your question about relationships, it's not just expanding the forms of relationships that we've learned within modernity, but really it's not rethinking, it's not reimagining, because these are all the part of the problem. It's about remanifesting the ways that we can relate. And I can say something that happened to me yesterday. So I started as a dean and at the University of Victoria, and I have some of my collaborators, Indigenous collaborators, came for an event, and they are here also to help me with the transition, and there's ceremony involved. And this ceremony involves greeting the land of the island that I arrived at, right? And greeting this land is not just how do you greet a land that you've been told forever that is not animate, right? And even after years of training, when I was asked to greet the land, there was part of me, a passenger on my bus. So the bus is a concept also, that a methodology that we use in the book, where you identify many people inside of you, many voices. There was a voice in me saying, okay, I have to anthropomorphize the land now, to talk to it, but it's all an intellectual exercise, right? And then I put I was asked by a young Indigenous leader, just put your hand in the land and forget about everything. Like just realize you are part of it, and that feel the land coming through your arms, and sense what it's sensing without fear of sensing its pain. And that's, for a minute, I could quiet the voices and really sense that there's a lot of pain out there, and there's a lot of joy as well. And part of me was saying, like, she must, or they must be angry at humans, like, you're bad. And then immediately came, no, you're doing it again. You're separating it again. It's part of it. It's not separate. So humans are part of the land. So I went through all this process. And then as I was going through it, he said, Mateus is here in this house too, but Mateus said, just let it go. Let the thoughts go. And just sense it. Feel it with your feet. Feel it with your hands. It was hard, even when you do have the intellectual constructs, to try, like, you can intellectualize the critique, but sensing it at the time is not easy. So, and we were on a beach, and I could only really see what he was talking about when some orcas came closer to the beach as we were doing that exercise. So when you see the response of the sea to what you're doing, that's when it switched. It yesterday for me. And it was unbelievable that, like, in my mind, this man can call the orcas kind of thing. But again, it was back to the intellectual frame of there's this man, then there's the orcas, there's me, and there's the land, rather than there's one thing, and one thing speaking to itself, rather than one thing speaking to each other. I think that example yesterday was, it shows me that, like, no matter how much you have the construct sensing it with your whole body is something completely different. Also because when we've been taught that we need to sense it in a particular way. So I see a lot of people wanting to connect with the land, connect with the whales, the sea, the stars, the sky, and the flowers, but not the shit. Like, we do not want to connect with the shit, and the shit is part of it too. So how do we figure out a way where we can connect with the beauty, but also the pain, and without drowning in this pain? Right? And how have other cultures, the aunties and uncles cultures, learned to process all of this differently? And how have we in this Western culture and Western institutions forgotten that? So one of the things, for example, that I've learned is that when you are struggling with the pain and the difficulty, talking about it may not be the best thing that you can do, but dancing with it could really help move it. So figuring out the things that we have, that we're missing out on, the exiled capacities that our bodies have, that we have forgotten, or they have been exiled, reactivating them, in thinking about us not as separate, or undoing all the separation that has been imprinted, ingrained. And that's the spell of modernity, right? On us is the work that needs to be done.
The wind is really strong here. As soon as you mentioned the orcas and the response that you got, we also got a response, and we're outside, which is incredibly helpful, I think, for this conversation. You mentioned, so another one of the last sentences of the book, if I'm not misremembering, is "No one is off the hook ever." And there's something really sort of profound about the way that the book speaks. Of course, it speaks to the most sort of violent complexes and systems and individuals in kind of colonial modernity, but it also speaks to those to forms of activism that still buy into certain logics of colonial modernity. And so I wanted to ask you a question sort of in general about who the book is for. And you do make this distinction between low-intensity struggle and high-intensity struggle. But who is the book for? And when you're talking about us, who is us also?
Thank you. That's, again, an incredible question. Yeah, so there are many different traps in this work. When you propose something in the current political moment we have of modernity, and the book is inviting us to think in diffractive ways, or in prismatic ways, with layers, right? So there are many layers, and one of the layers, there's a chapter in the book that is about engaging with politics in a different way, and understanding that the kinds of politics that we have right now, they still work to a certain extent, and they also create lots of problems. So the politics within modernity is marked in the book by 5 characteristics. The first one is that it's marked by this notion of exceptionalism, that human beings, or a specific group of human beings, or one genius human being is going to be able to lead. And then the second thing, it's 5 E's. It's exaltedness, that this human being needs to be held up so that the leading can happen, or this group of human beings can be held up. Then there's externalization of culpability. So there's the good people and the people who are doing the harm, rather than we're all part of this problem in different ways and with vulnerabilities unevenly distributed. Then there is this concept of empowerment, and empowerment first, which is about reinforcing certainties and desires rather than questioning them. And generally, this reinforcement of certainties and desires go with a bigger story of modernity, of progress, development, and civilization, and it's very dialectic in that sense. And the last one is emancipation. And again, like politically, emancipation from colonialism, from fascism and things like that, they can make sense in that layer, but we cannot be emancipated from the earth and what we're doing to it, right? That there's no emancipation from from the metabolism of the planet. So in end, we have to remember that in each context of each layer, depending on how these arguments land, they have different effects on the context and on people. So I'm very careful when I talk about that, because I know that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have claims to make still within the context of modernity that is extremely unequal, to be able to survive, right, and have access to minimal things within it that cannot be undermined by arguments that question the universality of these claims. And at the same time, we have to have the conversation of being in a house that is falling apart and is going to fall on the heads of the most vulnerable as well first. So it is a difficult conversation, but at the same time, when the book was written, I wanted, because it is inspired by Indigenous teachings, what I didn't want to see happening is an idealization and romanticization of a group of people that becomes superhuman, right? So, and this happens it's because of that kind of politics of emancipation, externalization of culpability, so on, exaltedness and exceptionalism, that from subhuman, this group or this like Black, Indigenous, or people of color, from subhuman they become superhuman, and the burden of the superhumanity is as difficult as the burden of being considered subhuman. So that the invitation of the book is for us to stop escaping into idealizations and staying with the complexity of things. And it was written for those of us who have been socialized and conditioned by modern/colonial formal education, and who have the time and the privilege and the literacies required to read the book. So when people ask me, why didn't you write a book for everybody? That universal book doesn't exist. And if I were to write a book for the communities in high intensity struggle, who I work with, number one, it wouldn't be a book. Number two, it would not, I would be more interested in their analysis and in having a conversation from there than in creating tools and concepts. They have a lot of tools and concepts already, right? I think it's the Western and modern colonial context that is lacking the tools that invite us to responsibility and that invite us to decenter ourselves, decenter our egos, disarm, declutter our unconscious or the subconscious, and disinvest in harmful desires, in harmful certainties, and in harmful ways of being.
Maybe we can just briefly, you've mentioned the bus, which was one of the reoccurring moment in which one gets all confused internally. And then you sort of invite a conversation between those passengers on the kind of bus. There are also other tools, and you speak at the beginning about the offering up medicines that you have a gift to sort of hold. Some of them is hold spaces for things that are uncomfortable without falling apart, and a few others. And then you have sort of tools that you've used in workshops, tools that you've used in practice, from sort of imagining future scenarios and having to. And the amazing thing that happens in a situation in which you put people in a workshop in which they have to imagine backwards what went wrong or how to understand it, and then all of a sudden things become really quite a lot easier to understand than in the kind of messy complexity of looking at them in the present. The passengers on the bus, there's also a lot of poetry, there's stories in the book. So perhaps a question there would be about how the book is composed of these practical sort of practices and rituals and tools and that you're inviting people to also practice. So it's a book that kind of is on the page, but is also very much in a relation with the reader, no?
Mm-hmm. I think, yes. I think it comes from a realization that the talking about things may shift some cognitive frames, intellectual frames, but there is in our current ways of intellectual exchange in Western culture, sometimes they don't land in the affective space, which is in the heart, and the relational space that is in the gut. So one of the things we've also learned from education in Indigenous communities, in the communities of the network, was a critique that said that Western culture, for Western culture, you educate the head and the body follows. But in Indigenous cultures, you don't educate the head first, you educate the gut. And the gut is relationality, it's practice. So the invitation to relate differently to oneself, to be able to hold space for the complexity of the self before you can even hold space for the complexity around you, which is actually also something in a dichotomy that doesn't exist because it's all related, right? But you educate the gut first, the heart then is cleansed and filled with other effects, and then the head follows. So that was very much one of the things that provided direction for the book, that just talking about it, offering statements, doesn't change anything. If the gut doesn't change, if the heart is not filled with other effects, and for the heart to be filled with other effects, you need to be able to process what's already in there and help move that. You need the cleansing process first, so that you can reactivate something that is more generative. So that all the exercises and tools were trying to speak to the guts, so that the heart could be cleansed and filled with something else, and that would activate the sense of visceral responsibility to open up to different reference, different cognitive reference, and go beyond cognition. Too, there is a collaboration that we have with an artist called Dani D'Emilia, who we have a text called Co-Sensing with Radical Tenderness that is in the book. But apart from the text, there's also a series of exercises that Dani and I have developed, and Dani has developed with other artists as well, that really bring it down to the gut. So, for example, one of, and we have like, sometimes it's day workshops, and they're week-long or sometimes 2-week-long workshops. But one of the exercises that I see as illustrating what I'm talking about is where you become comfortable enough after several exercises to have parts of your body naked to the world and to yourself and to each other in the room, but not completely naked. So you don't go completely. If you want, there is a point where you can be invited to do that, but you're given a piece of ice, a block of ice, very thick, and the invitation is to put the piece of ice between you and another body, and you choose where you want to put it. If it's in the belly, in the arm, or the back, you decide. But the idea is to wait for that piece of ice to melt, so that you can receive the body of another person in a very different way. And there's a narrative that goes with that helps you feel the numbness first, and then the pain. It's painful, and then you feel the water going through your body, and you're invited to sense it in a very different way, so that you're prepared to receive another body as part of your own. So I think that exercise shows that compare that to having a discussion about whether or not what I'm saying is universal, or if it is, I don't know, authentic or it's very different. It's very different talking from actually sensing and activating these other sensibilities of the body, all the other senses that the Aboriginal people in Australia talk about. They'd say we have 99 senses, not just 5. And that one of the senses that we have that is overriding the other ones, the other 94, is the sense of making sense into words. And we are at the point now where if it doesn't make sense into a word, it doesn't make sense at all. You just block it. So the part of the job is to open up all the other senses that are beyond words, that then help us to feel entangled and connected with both the beauty and the pain of everything. And that is what would make it to a different relationship with both aging and leaving and dying well.
Thank you. And there's a beautiful way that you put it at the beginning of the book, which is this expression, sort of modernity's tendency to word the world, and to it, you sort of next to it, you place the notion of worlding the world. And as I'm aware that we need to close, and we've taken quite a lot of you've been so generous with your time. I wanted to, so it's, I don't recall it being specifically addressed directly in the book, but I sort of left it with a sense of a feeling, very strong feeling of the importance of love, and feeling loved, not in a sense of an individual, but sort of a larger sense of feeling loved, and a larger sense of love, one that also encounters death and passing and pain and the shit. And just earlier today, Meilin Loko said something very beautiful, which was, if I'm paraphrasing, justice is what love looks like in public. And so I wanted to ask you if we could close with a few words on sort of we're wording the world again, unfortunately now too, but with a few words on love, perhaps.
Thank you. Love is a very loaded word, and especially in Western societies. And so because of all these layers of meaning, I generally, because then we say it, people understand something else. So love for me would be an inquiry into the depths of this compass that we need for sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability. So taking it out of the elation love that we just want to feel like it. Once we can manifest collectively, or when we can manifest collectively, the sobriety, which means that we interrupt the impulses, the harmful impulses of the ego and our addictions and neuroses, and sometimes we can interrupt that to be present to what's happening. We interrupt our delusions and escapisms into idealizations or vilifications. We can be present. So that's sobriety, a deeper meaning of sobriety. But maturity is about doing what is needed rather than what you want to do, and figuring out how to offer yourself in service to what is needed, even though it's not what you want to do, what your ego would have chosen to do. And then discernment is about being able to hold the weight of the multiple layers of complexity and all the paradoxes and tensions, and move things in a generative way towards responsibility and accountability and answerability, which is about interrupting the harm and being accountable to the debt that we have with that which has kept us alive, and the debt that we have with the future and those yet to come. So once we can manifest these things, then that word has this enriched meaning that is not trivialized as it generally is in normal conversations. So love for me is depth.
Vanessa Machado de Oliveira Andreotti, thank you so much for sharing this time with us. Thank you all for being with us as well. Thank you.